September 1945, Camp 186, Lancashire, England. The tin plate landed on the wooden table with a hollow clang that echoed through the mess hall. Gerda Hoffman stared down at the yellow kernels swimming in pale liquid, their surfaces catching the grey afternoon light filtering through the barred windows. The smell rose toward her face, sweet and unfamiliar, nothing like the turnip soup or black bread that had sustained her through the final desperate months of the war. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but her hands remained frozen at her sides. Around her, 200 German women stood in similar postures of confusion and suspicion, their eyes fixed on identical portions of something they could not name. The British officer who supervised the distribution had already left the hall. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. Gerda looked sideways at Anneliese Schmidt, whose thin fingers gripped the edge of the table. Anneliese had worked in a munitions factory in Stuttgart before the bombings scattered everything into ash and memory. Her face carried the same hollow expression they all wore now, the look of people who had crossed from one world into another and found nothing familiar on the other side. Someone near the back whispered the question that hung in every mind. The words carried through the quiet space with perfect clarity. "Is this pig food?" The syllables landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of uncertainty through the assembled prisoners. Gerda had seen corn before, or thought she had. In Bavaria, where she grew up, corn meant animal feed, dried, and ground for livestock during the lean winter months. Her father had grown it in small patches at the edge of their farm, but no human mouth had ever touched it at their table. Corn belonged to the barn, to the pigs and chickens, not to people who considered themselves civilized. The plate remained untouched. Minutes stretched into something longer. Gerda felt the weakness in her legs, the lightness in her head that came from months of insufficient calories. The British had captured her unit in April, near Hamburg, where she had served as a radio operator for the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps. The journey to England had taken weeks, passed in the holds of ships and the backs of trucks, sleeping on floors and eating portions that never quite filled the emptiness. Now this, yellow kernels in cloudy water, food for animals. Perhaps this was their punishment. Perhaps this was how the victors chose to humiliate the defeated. She thought of home. Not the home that existed now, somewhere in the Soviet zone, but the home of memory, before the war consumed everything. Her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, the smell of fresh bread and butter, the careful preservation of dignity, even in hardship. Germans did not eat corn. Germans ate potatoes and cabbage, dark bread and sausage, foods with weight and substance. Corn was what desperate people fed to their livestock when nothing else remained. The implication sat heavy in her chest. They were less than human now. The war had reduced them to this. But hunger has its own language, its own logic that operates beneath ideology and pride. Across the hall, a young woman named Clara Vogel lifted her spoon. Her hand shook slightly. She was perhaps 19, with dark circles beneath her eyes and a frame so thin her uniform hung loose at the shoulders. The entire room watched as she brought the spoon to her lips. The moment suspended itself in collective breath. Clara's expression flickered, confusion giving way to something else. She took another spoonful, then another. She did not stop. Gerda watched this transformation with the attention of a scientist observing an unexpected reaction. Clara's face had changed. The tension in her jaw had softened. Her eyes had lost that sharp edge of suspicion. She was eating with purpose now, with something approaching relief. The spoon moved from plate to mouth in steady rhythm, and other women began to notice, began to calculate their own decisions against this evidence. Anneliese moved next. She dipped her spoon into the kernels and raised it slowly. As if approaching something dangerous, the bite entered her mouth. Her eyes widened. She chewed carefully, thoughtfully, and then her shoulders dropped in a way that suggested surrender, not to defeat, but to unexpected mercy. The sound of her eating joined Clara's, a quiet percussion of metal against tin, and the spell broke. One by one, the women of Camp 186 began to eat. Gerda lifted her own spoon, bringing it close enough to smell the sweetness more clearly. The first taste arrived on her tongue with a shock of flavour. It was not animal feed. It was not punishment. It was sweet, genuinely sweet, with a texture that collapsed gently between her teeth and released something close to pleasure. The liquid around the kernels carried butter, she realised, real butter, not the ersatz oils and fats that Germany had substituted for years. She took another spoonful, then another, and felt the food settle into her empty stomach, like an answer to a question she had not known how to ask. The meal did not last long. The portions disappeared quickly, scraped clean with bread that the British provided alongside, white bread so soft it seemed like cake compared to the dense black loaves of home. When the plates were empty, the women sat in collective silence again. But this silence carried a different quality. It was the silence of reassessment, of assumptions overturned. They had eaten pig food and found it nourishing. They had accepted what they believed to be humiliation and discovered it was simply unfamiliar. To understand this moment requires stepping backward through time, into the decades and centuries that shaped what these women believed about corn, about food, about civilization itself. The story begins not in a Lancashire prison camp, but in the fields and kitchens of Europe, where cultural attitudes toward corn had calcified into something approaching religious conviction. Corn arrived in Europe in the 16th century, carried across the Atlantic by Spanish explorers who had learned its cultivation from indigenous peoples in the Americas. It spread quickly through Mediterranean regions, where the climate suited its growth, but its reception varied dramatically by latitude and culture. In Italy, corn became polenta, a staple food that fed the poor and working classes. In Romania and the Balkans, it transformed into mamaliga, serving similar purposes. These were survival foods, calorie-dense crops that allowed peasant populations to endure through seasons of scarcity. But Northern Europe rejected corn for human consumption almost immediately. The British, Germans, Scandinavians, and French regarded it with suspicion that hardened into contempt. This rejection had multiple roots. Corn required different preparation methods than traditional European grains. It lacked the gluten structure that allowed wheat to rise into proper bread. When eaten as the sole staple without adequate preparation, it could cause pellagra, a devastating nutritional deficiency disease that plagued corn-dependent populations who did not know how to process it correctly through nixtamalization, the traditional Mesoamerican technique that unlocked its nutritional value. Beyond these practical concerns lay something deeper, something that touched the heart of European identity. Wheat had been the grain of civilization since the ancient world. Wheat built Rome and Athens, fed medieval kingdoms, supported the entire structure of European society from peasant to king. Barley and rye occupied their own honoured places in the hierarchy of grains. Corn, this upstart from the savage Americas, carried the taint of the primitive, the colonial, the lesser. It was what backward people ate when they knew no better. Germans, who prided themselves on their cultural sophistication, their scientific achievements, their place at the pinnacle of European civilization, would no sooner eat corn than they would abandon their language or their history. This attitude had calcified by the 20th century into unquestioned dogma. German agricultural policy treated corn as animal fodder. Useful for fattening pigs and cattle, but unsuitable for human plates. German cookbooks contained no recipes for corn on the cob, no instructions for cornmeal mush or cornbread. The substance existed outside the boundary of what constituted proper food. When Germans encountered corn in the hands of foreigners, particularly Americans, they regarded it with a mixture of amusement and pity, the way one might regard a strange custom among primitive tribes. The Nazis had intensified this cultural prejudice by weaving it into their ideology of racial hierarchy. Food became another marker of superiority and debasement. The German diet, heavy with meat and potatoes, dark bread and dairy, represented the vital strength of the Aryan race. The Mediterranean diet, with its reliance on corn and other peasant crops, reflected the weakness and degeneracy of lesser peoples. Japanese prisoners received rice because their racial character demanded it. Slavic prisoners received minimal rations because their racial inferiority meant they required less. Every meal carried ideological weight. Every bite reinforced or challenged the structure of the world as the regime understood it. By 1945, Germany had starved. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed supply lines and food distribution networks. The Wehrmacht's collapse in the east released millions of refugees into the remaining German territory, all competing for vanishing resources. Civilians in cities ate sawdust bread and nettle soup. Rural populations fared slightly better, but winter stocks had depleted and spring planting had failed in the chaos of military collapse. The women who found themselves in British custody had lived through this desperate final chapter, watching their country disintegrate while their own bodies consumed themselves for fuel. Camp 186 in Lancashire housed approximately 2,000 German women, a mixture of military auxiliaries, Nazi party officials, concentration camp guards, and civilians caught in various categories of detention. The British had established it as part of a larger system processing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners across occupied territory. Unlike the massive POW camps that held combat soldiers, Camp 186 operated on a smaller scale, with barracks arranged around a central administration building and surrounded by wire fencing that suggested confinement without quite achieving prison severity. The British approach to feeding German prisoners followed guidelines established by the Geneva Conventions, which required captors to provide rations equivalent to their own troops. In practice, this meant British military rations, which included tinned meat, bread, tea, and sweet corn. The corn arrived in large cans, industrial-sized containers stamped with military procurement codes, part of the vast logistical machinery that fed British forces around the globe. It was standard fare, unremarkable to British soldiers who had grown up eating it without prejudice, but alien and disturbing to Germans who encountered it as their first meal under British supervision. The documentation from Camp 186 remains fragmentary. British military records note food distribution and prisoner counts, but rarely capture individual reactions or personal testimonies. What survives comes mostly from interviews conducted decades later, when surviving prisoners shared their memories with historians and documentary filmmakers. These accounts vary in detail, but converge on certain consistent themes. The shock of the corn, the initial refusal, the hunger that eventually overcame cultural conditioning, the dawning realization that what they had believed about food, about civilization, about their place in the world, might not correspond to reality. Gerda Hoffmann survived Camp 186 and returned to Germany in 1947, settling in Hamburg because her Bavarian home had been absorbed into the Soviet occupation zone and return seemed impossible. In an interview given in 1983, when she was 65 years old and working as a translator, she recalled that first meal with precise clarity. The memory had stayed sharp across nearly 40 years. She remembered the color of the corn, the smell of the butter, the texture against her teeth. She remembered her own resistance, the voice in her head insisting this was degradation, and the moment when that voice fell silent in the face of simple sustenance. She remembered something else as well. In the weeks that followed, as corn appeared regularly in their meals, the women of Camp 186 began to eat it without hesitation. The initial shock gave way to acceptance, then to something approaching appreciation. The sweetness became familiar. The butter-soaked kernels provided calories that their bodies desperately needed. The bread that accompanied it, white and soft, filled their stomachs with a satisfaction that black bread had never quite achieved. They gained weight slowly, their faces losing the gaunt hollowness of starvation. Their bodies began to function normally again. The corn had nourished them, pig food or not. Anneliese Schmidt kept a diary during her imprisonment, smuggling scraps of paper and pencil stubs past the guards who periodically searched their belongings. The diary survived because she carried it home in 1946, tucked inside the lining of her single suitcase. Her granddaughter donated it to the German Historical Museum in 1998, where it now rests in climate-controlled storage alongside thousands of other personal documents from the war years. The entries are terse, factual, constrained by the scarcity of paper and the need for secrecy. But they capture the daily reality of life in Camp 186 with an immediacy that official records cannot match. September 1945. First meal here. Yellow corn. Very strange. Afraid to eat it. Others eating now. I am so hungry. Finally ate. Not so bad. Sweet. September 1945. More corn today. Getting used to it. Stomach feels better than it has in months. The British Guards seem surprised we like it now. October 1945. They gave us corn on the cob tonight, still on the stalk, boiled. We did not know how to eat it. The guards showed us, biting the kernels off. We felt foolish. But it tasted good. Better than from the tin. These brief notations sketch the arc of transformation. The initial fear and resistance, the surrender to hunger, the gradual acceptance, the movement from survival to something approaching pleasure. Annalisa wrote nothing about ideology or civilization, nothing about what corn meant or did not mean. She recorded only the immediate facts of her experience, but those facts tell their own story about the malleability of belief when confronted with physical reality. Other women in Camp 186 had different reactions, different trajectories. Clara Vogel, the young woman who ate first that September afternoon, came from a farming family in Pomerania. The Soviet advance had engulfed her village in February 1945, killing her parents and scattering her siblings into the refugee columns that clogged every westward road. She had survived by attaching herself to a retreating Wehrmacht unit, working as a cook's assistant, and when the unit surrendered, she found herself classified as military personnel, despite never having formally enlisted. For Clara, the corn represented not humiliation, but mercy. She had eaten worse things in the final months of the war. She had scavenged frozen potatoes from bombed cellars and boiled tree bark for soup. The sweet corn tasted like abundance, like the end of suffering. Her cultural prejudices had burned away in the crucible of survival. Inga Bachmann, by contrast, refused the corn for 3 days. She had been a schoolteacher in Dresden before the firebombing destroyed the city and transformed her life into a sequence of displacements and losses. She had joined the Nazi Women's League not from ideological fervour, but from the practical recognition that membership opened access to food rations and administrative positions. When the Americans captured her in April, working in a military hospital near Chemnitz, she carried herself with a dignity that bordered on arrogance, refusing to acknowledge the collapse of everything she had believed. The corn offended her at a deep level, not because of hunger, but because of what it represented about her fall from civilization. But by the 4th day, watching the other women eat, watching them grow stronger while she grew weaker. Inga picked up her spoon. The first bite tasted like defeat. The second bite tasted like corn. By the end of the meal, she was crying, though whether from shame or relief, even she could not say. The tears fell onto the empty plate, and she sat there, alone in a room full of women, understanding that something inside her had broken, or perhaps had never been as solid as she believed. The nutritional value of corn explains part of this story, but only part. Sweet corn. The variety served in Camp 186 contains significant amounts of carbohydrates, protein, fibre and vitamins, particularly vitamin C and several B vitamins. The butter added to the British preparation provided essential fats that German prisoners had lacked for months or years. Together, these nutrients address the specific deficiencies that plague malnourished populations. The women of Camp 186 were not just eating corn. They were receiving medicine in the form of food, their bodies responding to nutrition with a gratitude that their minds took longer to acknowledge. But beyond the biochemistry lay a more complicated truth about culture, conditioning, and the stories people tell themselves about who they are. The German women in British custody had grown up in a society that taught them corn was animal food, unsuitable for civilized consumption. They had absorbed this lesson as thoroughly as they had absorbed lessons about grammar and history. It was simply a fact about the world, no more questionable than the law of gravity. When confronted with evidence that contradicted this fact, their first response was denial. The British must be mocking them. The British must be treating them as less than human. The realization that the British were doing no such thing, that British soldiers ate the same corn without shame or hesitation, that corn was simply food in British understanding, arrived slowly and with difficulty. It required these women to question not just their assumptions about corn, but their assumptions about civilization, about the hierarchy of cultures, about their own place in that hierarchy. If corn was not pig food, what else had they been wrong about? If the British, whom Nazi propaganda had portrayed as decadent and weak, ate corn and thrived, what did that suggest about German superiority? These questions had no comfortable answers. Some women worked through these questions consciously, deliberately. Others simply ate the corn and moved forward without deep reflection. The practical necessities of survival left little time or energy for philosophy. They needed to eat, to rebuild their strength, to navigate the complex bureaucracy of prisoner classification and repatriation. Whether corn was civilized or not mattered less than the fact that it filled their stomachs and kept them alive. Survival has a way of clarifying priorities. The broader context of post-war food distribution across occupied Germany reveals patterns that Camp 186 experienced in microcosm. American occupation authorities, confronted with widespread civilian starvation, imported massive quantities of food from the United States. Much of this food was corn-based: cornmeal, corn syrup, canned corn, corn oil. The Americans had corn in abundance and shipped it across the Atlantic in quantities sufficient to feed millions. German civilians receiving these rations faced the same cultural shock as the prisoners in Lancashire. This was not food. This was what Americans, those crude materialists with their lack of proper culture, fed to their animals and apparently to themselves. But Germans ate the corn because the alternative was starvation. They made cornmeal mush and cornbread and learned to cook with corn oil. They fed it to their children and watched those children grow healthier. Over time, grudgingly, corn entered the German diet not as a staple, but as an accepted component of the food landscape. By the 1950s, canned corn appeared on supermarket shelves in West Germany. By the 1960s, corn on the cob became an occasional summer treat. By the 1970s, few Germans remembered or cared about the old prejudice. Corn was just corn, food like any other, stripped of ideological significance. This transformation happened quietly, without fanfare or official recognition. No government proclamation declared corn acceptable. No cultural authority revised the standards of civilization. Germans simply began eating corn because it was there, because it was cheap, because it tasted fine once the shock of unfamiliarity wore off. The change occurred at the level of individual meals, individual choices, millions of small surrenders that accumulated into a shift in national foodways. Gerda Hoffmann, in her 1983 interview, described visiting the United States in 1972 for a conference of translators. Her host family in Ohio served corn at dinner the first night, fresh corn on the cob, dripping with butter. Gerda ate it without hesitation, enjoying the sweetness and the memories it stirred. Her hosts asked if she liked it. She told them about Camp 186, about that first meal in September 1945, about thinking it was pig food. They laughed, not unkindly, and said they supposed it must have seemed strange. She laughed too, aware of the distance she had travelled. The decades that separated that starving prisoner from this comfortable woman eating corn in an Ohio dining room. She told them something else as well, something she had not quite articulated before. The corn had taught her humility. Not the enforced humility of defeat, but the deeper humility of recognizing that her beliefs about the world were not the world itself. She had been wrong about corn. What else had she been wrong about? The question had haunted her for years, driving her away from the certainties of her youth toward a more tentative, more questioning engagement with life. The corn had been the beginning of that journey, the first crack in the structure of assumptions that had shaped her understanding. The women of Camp 186 returned to Germany between 1946 and 1948, depending on their classification and the bureaucratic machinery of repatriation. They scattered across the occupation zones, some returning to destroyed homes, others settling wherever they could find shelter and work. The bonds formed in captivity loosened as the pressures of reconstruction pulled them in different directions. A few maintained correspondence. Most lost touch, their lives diverging into separate trajectories of survival and rebuilding. Clara Vogel settled in Hamburg, where Gerda had also ended up, though they did not reconnect until the 1970s, when a television documentary about Camp 186 brought some survivors together for filming. Clara had married a British soldier she met while working as a translator for the occupation authorities. She moved to London in 1950 and raised 3 children who spoke English with native fluency and German with their mother's accent. She cooked corn regularly, teaching her children to eat it with butter and salt, and when they asked about it, she told them it reminded her of England, where she had learned that food was food, regardless of where it came from or what one had believed about it. Anneliese Schmidt returned to Stuttgart, finding her family's apartment building reduced to rubble. She lived in a displaced persons camp for 6 months before securing work as a secretary in the city administration office handling reconstruction permits. She married in 1948, had 2 daughters, and died in 1991 without ever speaking publicly about her war experiences beyond what she recorded in that small diary. Her granddaughter, reading the diary years later, asked her mother what the corn entries meant. Her mother did not know. The significance had not been passed down. The story had not been told. Only the terse notations remained, puzzle pieces without a picture to guide their arrangement. Inga Bachmann disappeared from the historical record after repatriation. The camp documentation lists her release date as March 1947, destination Dresden, but no subsequent trace survives. Dresden in 1947 was chaos, a Soviet-occupied ruin where records disappeared and people vanished into the confusion of resettlement. Perhaps she rebuilt her life there. Perhaps she moved west. Perhaps she died in the hard years immediately following the war. The corn she reluctantly ate sustained her long enough to leave Camp 186, but beyond that, silence. The physical remnants of Camp 186 disappeared decades ago. The barracks were dismantled in the 1950s, the land converted to agricultural use and later to suburban housing. A small plaque marks the approximate location, installed in 1985 by a local history society that researches wartime sites. The plaque mentions that German prisoners were housed there from 1945 to 1948, but provides no details about daily life, about meals or transformations or corn. Visitors who find the plaque, and few do, learn only that something happened here, that history touched this spot and moved on. The British military records from Camp 186 reside in the National Archives in Kew, accessible to researchers who request them. The files contain duty rosters, prisoner manifests, supply requisitions, medical reports, and incident logs. The requisitions show regular orders for tinned corn, listed alongside meat, bread, tea, and other staples. The quantities suggest each prisoner received corn approximately 4 times per week throughout the camp's operation. This represents millions of individual servings, millions of moments when German women put spoons to their mouths and chose to eat what their culture had taught them not to eat. No single moment changed these women. No epiphany struck with lightning clarity. The transformation happened gradually, through repetition and necessity, through the body's simple insistence that food was food. Cultural prejudices, even deeply held ones, cannot survive sustained contact with contradicting reality. The mind eventually adjusts, finding new ways to understand experience, new categories to contain what previously seemed incomprehensible. The women who believed corn was pig food discovered it was simply corn, no more degrading than bread or potatoes, just different, just unfamiliar. This process of adjustment, of learning to see the world freshly, extended far beyond food. The entire post-war period demanded such adjustments from Germans confronted with the ruins of their society and the crimes committed in their name. The corn was a small part of this larger reckoning, but it carried symbolic weight. If they had been wrong about corn, what else? If their certainties about civilization and hierarchy could be overturned by something as simple as a meal, how much of their worldview had been equally fragile? These questions had no easy answers, but they had to be asked. The corn insisted on it. By the 1960s, corn had become sufficiently integrated into German foodways that its foreign origins faded from popular consciousness. Younger Germans growing up in the Reconstruction period ate corn without prejudice, unaware that their parents and grandparents had once considered it animal feed. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany brought American products and American culture, including American food habits. McDonald's arrived in Munich in 1971, serving French fries cooked in corn oil and ketchup sweetened with corn syrup. Germans consumed these products eagerly, seeing them as symbols of modernity and prosperity rather than as threats to cultural purity. East Germany followed a different trajectory, but reached a similar endpoint. Soviet influence brought different foods, different prejudices, but corn appeared there too, cultivated as animal fodder, but gradually entering human diets as well. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, corn was simply part of the European food landscape, grown extensively across the continent, consumed without controversy. The old prejudices survived only in historical memory, curiosities that required explanation because contemporary reality provided no context for understanding them. The larger lesson, if there is one, operates at multiple levels. At the immediate level, the story illustrates how culture shapes perception, how beliefs about food connect to beliefs about identity and worth. At a deeper level, it reveals the fragility of such beliefs when confronted with necessity. And at the deepest level, it suggests something about the human capacity for change, for learning to see differently, for surrendering certainties in the face of experience. The women in Camp 186 did not stop being German when they ate the corn. They did not abandon their language, their memories, their sense of themselves. They simply expanded their understanding of what German could mean, what civilization could encompass. This expansion happened meal by meal, bite by bite, until the boundaries that had seemed fixed and natural revealed themselves as constructed and mutable. The corn did not change them. They changed themselves, using the corn as an occasion for transformation they might not have chosen, but ultimately accepted. History records large movements, grand narratives, the clash of armies and ideologies. It notes the dates of battles and treaties, the rise and fall of nations. But history also consists of countless small moments. Individual encounters with the unfamiliar, private surrenders of belief. A meal in a prison camp. Yellow kernels on a tin plate. The decision to eat or refuse. These moments accumulate into the larger patterns historians describe, but they retain their particularity, their human scale. They remind us that history happens not just in parliament buildings and on battlefields, but in mess halls and kitchens, wherever people confront the gap between what they believed and what they experience. Gerda Hoffmann died in 2003 in a Hamburg nursing home, surrounded by photographs of children and grandchildren who knew her as a translator, a widow, a woman who had lived through difficult times but rarely spoke about them. In her final weeks, when memory became unstable and past and present blurred together, she sometimes talked about corn, about being so hungry and so afraid. The nurses wrote this in their notes, puzzled by the fixation. What did corn mean? They could not know, could not access the significance packed into that simple word. To them, Corn was just corn, food you bought at the supermarket. Nothing remarkable. To Gerda, in those moments of confusion when the old world and the new world collapsed together, corn carried the weight of everything she had learned and unlearned, all the certainties she had surrendered, all the distance she had travelled from who she was to who she became. The afternoon light in the nursing home fell across her bed the same way it had fallen across that mess hall table in September 1945. The same grey English light filtered through institutional windows. She was eating pudding, soft food for failing teeth. But in her mind she was eating corn, tasting that first shocking sweetness, feeling her stomach settle, understanding without words that she would survive, that she would carry this moment forward into an unknowable future where corn would just be corn, but would always also be more than that, would always be the measure of how far she had fallen and how far she had climbed. This is what freedom tastes like, though no one can recognize it in the moment of first contact. It arrives disguised as something else, something disturbing and unwelcome. It announces itself as loss rather than gain, as the stripping away of certainties rather than the acquisition of truth. Freedom is the corn you thought was pig food, the meal that forces you to choose between starving in your righteousness and eating in your humility. It is the recognition that the walls you believed protected you were actually confining you, that the categories you trusted to organize the world were convenient fictions rather than natural laws. The abundance comes later, after the initial surrender. It comes in the gradual understanding that the world is larger than you believed, that your way of seeing is not the only way, that other people in other places have solved the same problems of hunger and shelter and meaning in ways you never imagined because you never had to imagine them. The corn was abundant. British warehouses held enough to feed thousands. American ships brought millions of tons more across the Atlantic. The problem was never the scarcity of corn, but the scarcity of imagination, the poverty of a worldview that could not recognize nourishment when it arrived in an unfamiliar form. Ideology builds walls around the imagination and calls them protection. It tells stories about who you are, about what separates you from the other, about why your way is the only way that respects human dignity. These stories feel true because everyone you know accepts them, because they connect to deeper stories about nation and history and identity. Questioning them feels like questioning yourself, like pulling at a thread that might unravel everything. Better to starve than to eat corn. Better to preserve the purity of your beliefs than to compromise with mere reality. But the body makes demands that ideology cannot answer. The stomach insists. The weakness spreads. The choice presents itself in unavoidable terms. Adapt or perish. And so you adapt, reluctantly, angrily, with profound resistance. You take the first bite. You discover it does not poison you. You take the second bite. You discover it sustains you. You take the third bite and notice you are no longer thinking about whether this is proper or civilized. You are just eating, just living, just continuing into the next moment and the moment after that. This is how empires fall, not in dramatic battles, but in small surrenders repeated across millions of meals. This is how certainties dissolve, not through philosophical argument, but through the stubborn insistence of experience. This is how people change, not through conversion or revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of adaptations so small that each one seems meaningless until you look back and realize you have become someone you would not have recognized. The corn changes nothing and everything. It is just food. It is the end of the old world and the beginning of something you do not yet have the language to name. The women of Camp 186 ate their corn and went home to Germany and rebuilt their lives. They learned English or Russian, or simply learned to navigate the new landscape of occupation and reconstruction. They married and raised children and found work. They became the generation that rebuilt Europe from ruins, that absorbed the lessons of total war and built something different on the ashes. They rarely talked about the corn. Why would they? It was such a small thing, such a trivial moment in years of tremendous upheaval. But the small things persist. The small things carry weight that the large things somehow miss. The plate on the table, the yellow kernels catching the light, the moment of decision, the surrender of pride to necessity, the recognition that you are not what you believed, that the world is not what you were told, that freedom and abundance arrive not as validation of your superiority, but as an invitation to humility, to growth, to the hard work of seeing freshly. This is what transformation looks like at the human scale. This is what it means to cross from one world into another. This is how the old dies and the new is born, one bite at a time, one choice repeated until it becomes habit, until it becomes nature, until you forget you ever believed otherwise, and the children you raise grow up in a world where corn is just corn, and the old prejudices survive only in stories, myths, from a time that seems impossibly distant, though it was only yesterday, only a lifetime ago. Only as far back as that September afternoon when you first lifted the spoon and chose to continue living.